Greetings, YouTube. What would you like to see? We want to see the water. Pour the bloody pond. I give you resin.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 6 of my N-Gauge layout build. I'd once again just like to thank everyone for tuning in. There's been a lot of good feedback and been really pleased to hear that some people have actually started layouts after seeing these videos, so cheers for your comments, guys. As you've probably seen by the title of this episode, we are going to be creating the resin pond this time around, and let's just say it didn't go exactly to plan. But before we can start with that, there is a little bit of groundwork to cover, so let's crack on with that. We're going to start by planting a wooden fence along the front of the layout, which sections off an area of grazing land. This card product here is available from N-Scenics, which simulates a wooden fence. I've painted it with brown acrylic and done a little bit of sponge weathering to add some variation to the colour. After a bit of experimenting, I found that using some thin brass rod to reinforce the card made for a much sturdier fence and also allowed me to poke the rod into the foam baseboard to glue it in place more easily. With the fence painted and ready, it's simply a case of poking a small hole in the foam baseboard with my vice drill and slowly working the fence into the right position. It was a pretty fiddly task and required a fair bit of trial and error, but once I had it all dry fitted and was happy with where it was placed, I used some PVA glue on the bottom of the brass rods and got it all set in place. After I had fitted the wooden fence, I also added a metal fence around the goods depot. I used a photo etch metal product for this and painted it blue and added some subtle rust effects with a sponge. And with both the fences up, I continued adding some more static grass to the layout, deliberately going lighter in the farmland area to simulate it having been eaten by the sheep. Unfortunately, I didn't take much footage of the next step, which is a shame as it was a big transformation for the layout. In this stage, I used a variety of Woodland Scenics foam products to simulate different types of plants, shrubs, and small trees. I placed them around the layout, and when I was happy with where they were, I simply glued them down with first a soaking of IPA and then PVA, and left everything overnight to dry. And once it was all done, I was really amazed with what a difference it made. And I'm going to show you a few images of that in a second after the next step. So one final detail to finish off the sheep area, and that is of course the sheep themselves. These are a off-the-shelf product, so it's simply a case of picking a place for each of the sheep and then gluing them down with a tiny bit of super glue. Personally, I think that people and animals are what makes a scene really come alive, so I was glad to get these little guys down on the layout. And with the sheep down, we can take a look at the layout as a whole. You can see how the addition of bushes and shrubs has broken up the carpet of static grass and makes everything look a lot more interesting and natural. I think it reinforces the impression that we're looking at something wild and not a well manicured golf course. Now it's time for another little detail. I've bent up these levers from some brass rod to act as the point levers for the points on the layout. They've been painted black with Vallejo black primer and then a white block at the top, as that's what they all look like in images that I found on the internet. These then get stuck down onto the little wooden sort of platforms that we made from spare sleepers. And now we're going to give a little bit of love to the goods depot itself. The whole thing looked a little bit clean, and despite the card printing from the Metcalf kit actually having a fair bit of variation in the colour, I just wanted to add a little bit more and reinforce the idea that this is a building that's been used for a long time and not being kept particularly well. So I did this with some oil paints. I basically dot them onto the card and then use a brush which is damp with low odor thinner to blend the colour into the card. It's a little bit tricky and this didn't go 100% to plan. There's a very brief window where you can actually spread the oil properly without it looking unnatural. I think overall it's an improvement, but I'm definitely still learning this process. Before we pour the resin, I wanted to add some reeds to the bed of the pond, and as always, good old Woodland Scenics has me covered with product for this purpose. However, this did prove a little harder than I had originally thought, so this poor little fella wasn't quite standing up to attention. But don't worry buddy, it happens to the best of us. After some perseverance, I did manage to get a few nice little clumps standing up in the bed of the pond. So with that done, we've got everything ready to pour the pond. For that we're going to use something called Envirotex Light, which is a 2-part epoxy resin, recommended by our Lord and Saviour Luke Towan here on YouTube. To use it, all we have to do is mix part A and B in equal amounts and mix them up together. Sounds easy enough, right? Well, let's see how it goes. Whilst having an open side to the water will hopefully look cool, it presents us with an obvious challenge, whereby we need to stop all the resin running off of the side of the layout. I've seen people on YouTube hot gluing plastic card to form a dam, but A, I don't have a hot glue gun, and B, I didn't want to glue anything to the side of the layout for fear of leaving visible marks on the outside of the baseboard which I wouldn't be able to remove. So I opted to rely purely on masking tape. Roughly 4,000 layers should do the trick. With the dam complete, we're ready to pour the resin itself. I start out by measuring out very roughly equal amounts of part A and part B of the resin and thoroughly mixing them together. And once they're thoroughly mixed in one container, we pour them into a second to continue mixing as per the instructions on the Envirotex packaging. To colour the resin, I'm using some liquid pigments that I got off of Amazon. You get a whole load of colours for not a lot of money, and in this case I'm just using brown and blue to get a nice murky colour. So with everything mixed up, it's simply a case of pouring the resin into the pond area. I'm going pretty slow here and starting at the deepest point and just letting the resin rise and find its own level as we go. Now, mistake number one here was that I didn't mix up enough resin to begin with, so I quickly put together what I had left and poured it in. The resin has a fair amount of surface tension, so I worked it into the areas around the reeds, rocks and shores to get it looking nice and natural. I was expecting there to be bubbles, and there certainly were a lot of bubbles, but I felt safe knowing that they can be popped simply by blowing on them, as the carbon dioxide in your breath causes them to burst. So I blew, and I continued blowing, and I blew some more. But despite my best efforts, what should have been my beautiful pond still looked like the result of Shrek sneezing onto my layout. I continued breathing in the general direction of the resin pond, but it appeared that, unlike my poor university grades, this was a problem I wouldn't be able to blow my way out of. No matter what I did, the bubbles just would not clear. I toyed with the idea of letting it set,
telling myself that it didn't look that bad, but in reality it looked terrible. So I made the decision to cut my losses and clean the resin out as best as I could with some kitchen roll.
Well, that went about as badly as it possibly could. Instead of a nice pond, it looked like dog saliva was covering my railway, so I cleaned it up in a blind panic and didn't film any of it. I thought that despite my cleanup efforts, the whole layout may have been ruined, but after my head had cleared a little bit, it looks like things are salvageable. I'm just glad that I did mop up the resin, because trying to remove it once it had all set would have been almost impossible. So I resolved myself to having a second crack at the pond, but before we can do that, let's have a little look at the salvage operation to make everything nice and neat for the second resin pour.
Prior to the bubble disaster, whilst making my 4,000 layer of tape resin dam, I'd envisaged pulling off this tape would be as satisfying as taking the film off of a new phone, revealing pristine wood beneath. However, despite the tape not allowing of any of the resin to fully leak, it had sort of seeped between the masking tape layers and the baseboard, leaving a thin but incredibly hard to remove layer of resin on my lovely wood panels. No matter what I tried, I couldn't get the resin to peel off, so I resorted to sanding the whole thing down, which is a little bit unfortunate and also took forever. Just like every time I face a large amount of sanding, I promised myself that this time I'm going to buy an electric sander, but then inevitably I just end up stubbornly using sandpaper until the job is done, and promising myself that next time I'll buy that electric sander. With the side sanded up, that means most of the damage has been repaired, and after purchasing some more resin, it's time for Operation Pour the Pond Mark II. Now the question is, what are we going to do differently this time to improve things? Well, number one is to improve our dam design. Out with the veritable pile of masking tape, and in its place we use just 2 layers backed up by a big old bit of wood and a couple of huge F-clamps to keep the whole thing in place. Secondly, and most importantly, this time off screen I have warmed up the resin in a bowl full of hot water from the tap for about 15 minutes. The theory here is that when I did the first pour, the cold January temperature meant that the resin was too viscous to allow the tiny bubbles to rise up to the surface and pop. Warming it up should thin the mixture and let it all clear up without too much trouble. At least that's the theory. Once again, the mixture was tinted with liquid pigment, and upon pouring it onto the layout, it was immediately clear that things were looking much, well, clearer. Almost all of the tiny bubbles were gone, and those that were present very quickly rose to the surface, and I could pop them just by gently breathing on them. In fact, things were looking a little bit too clear. It dawned on me that perhaps I'd used far too little of the pigment, and my murky pond instead looked positively potable. Once again, that feeling of panic rose up within me, and I knew time was running out to make a quick decision before the resin started to set. So I decided to go for it. I whipped out the liquid pigment and squeezed out another 10 drops or so of the brown colour, and began frantically trying to mix it all in together whilst it was setting on the layout itself. Fortunately for me, after a few minutes of furious wrist action, everything was looking okay. I covered the resin with some polystyrene I had laying around to reduce the amount of dust settling on it, and left it to set.
So we've completed the second resin pour. The dam hasn't leaked at all, and the resin is almost entirely free of bubbles, so things are looking really good. There is going to be a little bit of work to neaten everything up, including repainting the baseboard, so let's get started with that.
Upon removing the polystyrene cover and taking the wood dam off, I could see everything was looking fantastic. Now, it's time for the super satisfying tape removal. Well, that was a bit of a fail, but you can't have everything, I guess. At least this time, I could see that the dam had been much more effective, and the resin had been entirely contained within the area I wanted it with no leakage at all. One downside of me having to mix up the resin on the layout was that I had disturbed the water pretty significantly and it had left tide marks on the shore, and also where the dam had been. Operation Cleanup 2 begins with me working a chamfer onto the edge of the resin to remove that raised tide line, and also so that we don't leave a sharp, easily damaged edge on the resin water.
I'm using a combination of a knife, file and sanding stick to get the shape that I want, and also to remove the texture that the masking tape left.
It will need a lot more refining from here and a good polish, but for now I think it's looking pretty good. Next we begin trying to sort the shoreline out. I'm using some dirt coloured pigment powder here to lay down a very opaque dirt colour over the areas which have become shiny due to the resin covering the grass. And once I'm happy with where it all is, I use some pigment fixer to set it in place. Next we're going to begin repairing the grass itself. I'm going to start off with a very thin layer of 1mm grass, and as usual I apply some static tack glue with an old brush, and because the grass is so short there's no point in using the static grass applicator, so I just apply it with a small sieve to form the base layer. And once that layer has been applied and allowed to dry, we come in and add some more glue for the second layer. This one is made up of a mix of colours using fibres between 2 and 4mm long. As this grass is a little longer, I've whipped out our favourite girthy tool, the static grass applicator. To gain a little bit more control over where the grass goes, I've taped up the inside of the applicator lid so that the grass can only fall through a relatively small aperture in its centre, so that I don't end up getting grass everywhere. Now that the pond is looking pretty much repaired, we're going to dress the baseboard back up by reapplying the varnish where I had to sand it off after the first resin disaster. But it's not as simple as just slapping some on with a paintbrush, because I want to preserve the ability to look through the translucent water from the side of the baseboard. So to do this, I put a layer of masking tape over the resin, and then I came up with a bit of a weird trick to cut it exactly where I needed it to go. I used a torch to let me see exactly where the cut had to be, because as the resin is translucent, the light could penetrate it and that would give me a nice sharp line to cut to. I worked along the length of the tape very carefully with a sharp scalpel, and then very nearly achieved the satisfying tape reveal that has eluded me for this whole video. So here we are once again back in the garage painting the baseboard. I've been very careful not to apply too much varnish at once here, because I wasn't sure how well the tape would actually hold the varnish back, and I didn't want to apply too thick of a layer because it might leave a noticeable lip where the tape had been. I applied 2 reasonably thin coats here before leaving it overnight to dry. So here we go, attempt number 4 on the satisfying tape removal. And unfortunately, once again, we fail pretty hard. However, at least this time, once the tape was removed, the result was pretty much perfect. I was pretty happy with this because it felt like a bit of a gamble trying to tape up and apply the varnish, so 2 thumbs up from me that it's turned out nicely. So the only thing left to do is to polish up the resin with some car polish. This did take up a fair bit of elbow grease, but after a fair bit of rubbing and some patience, everything was looking pretty good.
So it did take us a couple of goes, but now we've got a really cool looking murky pond. We've now also caught up to the point in the build where I started making these videos, and I bought a DSLR for these talking head pieces, which also takes really nice still images, so we can enjoy some high quality photos of the whole layout. Let's take a look. So the lesson learned here is to warm up your resin. Once I got the process correct, the pond ended up looking really awesome. It's very smooth and reflective, with almost no bubbles to speak of, and I'm happy with how murky / translucent the pond is. I am really glad I added the extra pigment, because otherwise I think it would have been a little bit too transparent. As it is, from this slightly higher angle, you can just see some of the rocks on the pond bed, and I think that adds a really nice 3D effect to the pond, which is the whole point of using resin over PVA or some other medium for simulating water. From this angle, we can see how if you get down nice and low to the layout, you get a cool reflection of the trains as they go past. I think this really helps to lend a sense of scale to the layout, and looking at a picture like this, it's easy to forget that that little jinty is about the size of my thumb. Now if we look at the layout as a whole, I think the addition of the final layers of static grass and various types of foliage have helped to both blend the scene together and to add even more variation to the wild areas. I've tried to use the natural elements to tell a story as much as possible. For example, we can see how the sheep have kept their field pretty low cut, whilst the other areas of the layout are more overgrown. In addition to this, the sidings furthest away from the goods sheds are slightly more overgrown than those that are closer, where there would be more foot traffic. This is the first time the layout has essentially been complete, in inverted commas. Don't get me wrong, there are lots more things I'd like to do until I'm happy with it, particularly around the goods yard, but there now aren't any large areas which stick out as being unfinished. The elephant in the room here, of course, being the total lack of backseam. I'm definitely going to make one. At the minute I'm just trying to figure out how I want to put it together. But seeing as the resin pour was the aspect of the scenery I was most worried about, I'm very glad to have it done, and I'm very pleased with the results. So that's the end of this episode. Thanks very much for watching. Next time we're going to attempt to do a running session of the Inglenook shunting layout, so I hope to see you for that one. See ya.